What's up, YouTube? It's your boy JP's on the keys, and it's too easy about the video today. And I see that y'all liked when I did the last Thomas Sowell video about, the reparations and whatnot. But this is the hidden truth behind the end of slavery. So, I'm going in this fresh mind, neutral point of view. If you like the video, leave a like, hit that subscribe button. I appreciate all the support that y'all been showing. Let's go, man. I need some water. Parts 1. Black rednecks and white liberals.
Slavery was destroyed within the United States at staggering costs in blood and treasure, but the struggle was over within a few ghastly years of warfare. Nevertheless, the Civil War was the bloodiest war ever fought in the Western Hemisphere, and more Americans were killed in that war than in any other war in the country's history. But this was a highly atypical, indeed.
I don't know why they say the more Americans were killed in this war. Obviously, it's a civil war. Everyone in the war is American. Obviously, everyone who dies is going to be an American death. Of course, a civil war in America would lead to the most American deaths in the history of the. Obviously, was that an overreaction? I don't know. Maybe I don't know.
Unique way to end slavery. In most of the rest of the world, unremitting efforts to destroy the institution of slavery went on for more than a century, on 1,000 shifting fronts, and in the face of determined and ingenious efforts to continue the trade in human beings. Within the British Empire, the abolition of slavery was accompanied by the payment of compensation to slave owners for what was legally the confiscation of their property. This cost the British government £20 million, a huge sum in the 19th century, about 5% of the nation's annual output. A similar plan to have the federal...
And I think, let me do the math on that. 20 billion, 19th century, this is when they ended. And I know, all right, so this is the inflation. He said that it's 20 million pounds. So we're going to do bang, 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 bang. One more zero. There you go. 20 million. And the year Britain ended slavery in 1807. 58 years before the United States did. This is $20 million in 1807. Almost $2 billion now. Just think about that. That's almost 10 times the amount.
Government of the United States buy up the slaves and then set them free was proposed in Congress, but was never implemented. The costs of emancipating the millions of slaves in the United States would have been more than half the annual national output, but still less than the economic costs of the Civil War.
That's what I'm
Quite
saying.
Aside from the cost in blood and lives, and a legacy of lasting bitterness in the South, growing out of its defeat and the widespread destruction it suffered during that conflict.
I think people, speaking of the ending of slavery, I think people give Abraham Lincoln a little bit too much credit, because Abraham Lincoln originally did not want to free the slaves. He was like, you know what? If y'all want to have slaves in the South, you can have slaves in the South. So it's like, he kind of had to do it for a political issue. He kind of had to. If slavery was one of the issues, one of the biggest issues of the Civil War, states' rights was also another issue, but slavery was the forefront. So it's like, I kind of have to do this, because this is what's politically going to help me, win the presidency. He freed the slaves, though. You know what I'm saying? I can't really get mad at you for that, even though it took another 100 years for former slaves and black people to finally not be subjected under the law, like government oppression. You know what I'm saying? You can't say that segregation, Jim Crow, and and the black codes and all that and the fugitive slave law, you can't say that wasn't government oppression. That was government regulated oppression. That's systematic racism. That's some real systematic racism. That's really systematic racism if we really going to talk about America being systematically racist. That was systematically racist. Like literally putting laws into place to prevent a certain group of people from accessing different things. That's systematic racism. When there's actual laws in place. You feel what I'm saying?
While the British could simply abolish slavery in their Western Hemisphere colonies, they faced a more daunting and longer-lasting task of patrolling the Atlantic off the coast of Africa in order to prevent slave ships of various nationalities from continuing to supply slaves illegally. Even during the Napoleonic Wars, Britain continued to keep some of its warships on patrol off West Africa. Moreover, such patrols likewise tried to interdict the shipments of slaves from East Africa through the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf. Brazil capitulated to British demands that it end its slave trade after being publicly humiliated by British warships that seized and destroyed slave ships within Brazil's own waters. In 1873, 2 British cruisers appeared off the coast of Zanzibar and threatened to blockade the island unless the slave market there shut down. It was shut down.
Thank you, Britain. I appreciate you, Britain, for continuing to fight slavery even after you abolished it, for continuing to fight slavery in other countries. Thank you, Britain. Why does nobody talk about the slavery in the Middle East and Africa that's going on today, man? Why does nobody talk about that? To be honest, probably because it's brown people enslaving other brown people, and that's not really an issue for a lot of people. People don't care about that. You feel what I'm saying? So it's like, I don't know, but I feel like that should still be a topic, you know, slave trade, especially in Libya, Middle East, Africa, these 2 countries that have 2 like regions of the world that have been kind of thrown underneath the back burner, to be honest, if we being all the way for real.
It would be hard to think of any other crusade pursued so relentlessly for so long by any nation at such mounting costs without any economic or other tangible benefit to itself. These costs included bribes paid to Spain and Portugal to get their cooperation with the effort to stop the international slave trade, and the costs of maintaining naval patrols and of resettling freed slaves, not to mention dangerous frictions with France and the United States, among other countries. Captains of British warships who detained vessels suspected of carrying slaves were legally liable if those vessels turned out to have no slaves on board. The human costs were also large. The heavy drain, physical and mental, in keeping squadrons on the East African coast was reflected in the loss of 282 officers and men in the 10 years 1875 to 1885. And this did not include those invalidated home. Naval personnel, racked by fever, sunstroke, and dysentery, were forced to retire prematurely and live on a small pittance. The cost of upkeep of the squadron over the 20 years prior to 1890 was estimated at 4 million sterling, and this did not take into account the large amount of work imposed on consular and judicial staff at Zanzibar in trying cases and dealing with reports, etc. Even so, the results were slow in coming. More streamlined slave ships were designed in hopes of being able to outrun the ships of the Royal Navy in the Atlantic. Nevertheless, the dogged persistence of the British eventually reduced the shipment of slaves across the Atlantic and across the waters of the Islamic world.
Just think about that. They were redesigning ships to make them more compatible for slaves. Think about it. They were redesigning. They were upgrading ships to... Just think about that. You got so much money invested in slave labor that you're literally using that money to build better ships so you can more efficiently take slaves back to your country.
Although the French flag was for many years widely used as protection from the boarding of ships on the high seas by the British Navy, even by slave traders who were neither French nor authorized to fly the French flag, eventually France itself turned against slavery, outlawed the institution, and sent some of its own warships to patrol the Atlantic off the coast of Africa to intercept and deter the shipment of slaves to the Western Hemisphere. The American flag was likewise so used, and the United States, like France, eventually turned against the slave trade and sent warships to join the Atlantic patrols to interdict slave shipments. Although by 1860 the Atlantic slave trade had been effectively stopped, the slave trade from East Africa across the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf took longer to be reduced significantly. Off the east coast of Africa, smaller Arab vessels called dhows hugged the coastlines in waters too shallow for the British warships to enter.
This is the slave trade that nobody talks about. They keep trying to act like this don't exist either, bro. I'm not getting on anybody who's of Middle Eastern descent, but I'm just saying they only focused on Middle Eastern people when it revolves around terrorist activities or suspected terrorist activities. Not the fact that some of them are enslaving Africans, and it's even Africans enslaving other Africans. And it's even in the Asian countries. What about India, China, like Japan? Bro, you feel what I'm saying? Like,
one British commodore estimated that he captured one dhow for every 8 that escaped. Nevertheless, during the period from 1866 to 1869, 129 slave vessels were captured and 3,380 slaves were freed. When the threat of being boarded seemed imminent, the Arabs would throw slaves overboard to drown, rather than have them be found on board, which could lead to British seizure of the vessel and punishment of those who manned it. The worst that could befall the slaves was when the slaver was overhauled by a British cruiser, and they might then be flung overboard to dispose of all evidence. Devereux mentions a case where the Arabs, when pursued by an English cruiser, cut the throats of 24 slaves and threw them overboard. Colomb also states that Arabs would not hesitate to knock slaves on the head and throw them overboard to avoid capture. Because there were only a few naval ships available to cover a vast expanse of water in this region, British warships would often launch smaller boats to engage the Arab slave dhows. In these cases, as one study put it, the slave traffickers frequently did not hesitate to attack boat crews in defense of their profits. Battles between the Arabs' vessels and the smaller British craft were especially likely when the larger ships that launched them were too far away to reach the scene in time to join the battle. In other cases, the Arabs fled even from the smaller British vessels. An episode in 1866 was typical. On 26 April 1866, the Penguin set out after a dhow and fired several shots in an effort to make the crew come to. When the dhow failed to lower its sail, Gartorth felt certain that she was a slaver and ceased firing for the sake of the slaves on board. However, he managed to close with the dhow, which then made for the rocks through a heavy surf. By the time the ship's boats could be lowered to follow, the Arab crew had fled, but the pounding surf made any attempt by the slavers to salvage the human cargo too dangerous. To their horror, the boat crew found that they too could not reach the dhow, which was rapidly filling with water, drowning the slaves. The boat officer decided that he could not risk coming in close to the dhow, but several of the crewmen of the cutter recklessly dived in and swam through the surf to the dhow. In a remarkable display of courage, the sailors managed to bring 28 of the slaves back to the boat. But the dhow appeared to have had more than 200 slaves on board, and most died in the pounding waves.
That's crazy, though. Just think about that. Instead of even... You would rather jump off the boat than avoid getting captured. And you got people from the British and French and all the other. You got people jumping off the boats, swimming through this really strong current, trying to save slaves off a ship. Just think about that, bro. That's admirable. I respect that. That's very admirable. You know what I'm saying? I would never discourage somebody who fights against slavery. I respect that. You know what I'm saying?
In another episode, the Arabs' ruthlessness toward the slaves was further revealed. When the Daphne's cutter captured a dhow with 156 slaves on board, many were found to be in the final stages of starvation and dysentery. One woman was brought out of the dhow with a month-old infant in her arms. The baby's forehead was crushed, and when she was asked how the injury had happened, she explained to the ship's interpreter that as the boat came alongside, the baby began to cry. One of the dowmen, fearing that the sailors would hear the cries, picked up a stone and crushed the child's head. This was not a unique act. British missionary and explorer David Livingstone related a similar incident on land. One woman, who was unable to carry both her load and young child, had the child taken from her and saw its brains dashed out on a stone. Dr. Livingstone also reported having nightmares for weeks after encountering Arab slave traders and their victims. Not only was this Christian missionary shocked by the brutality of the Arab slave traders, so was Muhammad Ali, the ruler of Egypt, who was a battle-hardened military commander. None of this means that the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade should be ignored, downplayed, or excused, nor have they been. A vast literature has detailed the vile conditions under which slaves from Africa lived and died during their voyages to the Western Hemisphere. But the much less publicized slave trade to the Islamic countries had even higher mortality rates en route, as well as involving larger numbers of people over the centuries.
Like, we can talk about the American slavery all day, you know what I'm saying? American slavery was horrible too. But you can't excuse this. You can't act like this never existed. Like, people act like this never existed. People act like slavery only existed in the United States. Like, I don't understand, bruh. Like, it pays to pick up a book. It pays to go on the internet and look up some documents. It pays to do some research. You feel what I'm saying? It pays to learn about where you came from, to learn about your history. Because, like they say, those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. You feel what I'm saying?
Even though the Atlantic slave trade had higher peaks while it lasted. By a variety of accounts, most of the slaves who were marched across the...
And they never told us about the Arab slave trade in school. They always told us about the transatlantic slave trade, even though, you know what I'm saying? Even though I still don't think that was a good topic to teach the 12-year-olds and 10 and 12-year-olds, but you know what I'm saying? Talk about slavery and how they was getting... personally, for me, I didn't want to hear about that when I was in middle school, but it is what it is.
The Sahara toward the Mediterranean died on the way. While these were mostly women and girls, the males faced a special danger: castration to produce the eunuchs in demand as harem attendants in the Islamic world. Because castration was forbidden by Islamic law, the operation tended to be performed, usually crudely, in the hinterlands, before the slave caravans reached places within the effective control of the Ottoman Empire.
Of course.
The great majority of those operated on died as a result. But the price of eunuchs was so much higher than the price of other slaves that the practice was still profitable on net balance. The British Governor-General of the Sudan, C.G. Gordon, estimated that between 1875 and 1879, from 80,000 to 100,000 slaves were exported through his region. General Gordon imposed the death penalty on those convicted of castrating slave men to market them as eunuchs. His attempt to stamp out slave trading in the Sudan cost him his own life as an opposing army, raised and led by Muhammad Mahad, defeated his troops at Khartoum in 1885 and killed Gordon, after which the slave trade flourished again.
1885! This is almost the 20th century, bro! This is still almost the 20th century, and they're still having fights over slavery in 1885. And you know what? In 2022, it's still that going on today.
British control in the region was firmly re-established in 1898 by the crushing victory of troops led by Lord Kitchener at Omdurman, and including a young officer named Winston Churchill. On the issue of slavery, it was essentially Western civilization against the world. At the time, Western civilization had the power to prevail against all other civilizations. That is how and why slavery was destroyed as an institution in almost the whole world. But it did not happen all at once or even within a few decades. When the British finally stamped out slavery in Tanganyika in 1922, it was more than half a century after the Emancipation Proclamation in the United States, and vestiges of slavery still survived in parts of Africa into the 21st century.
Exactly, bro. Exactly. Like I said before, this is not a personal attack. If you are of Middle Eastern descent, if you're Arab, I'm not trying to attack you or nothing, but I'm just saying we can't gloss over this part of history. You know what I'm saying? They always remind us about the Western slavery, the American slavery. What about in the Middle East and the fact that Britain was effective in stopping it? Britain led the charge in stopping slavery in the world, to be honest. They were I think in the Revolutionary War, weren't they were recruiting slaves from America to fight for the British. They were, because they knew what it was. We'll offer you freedom if you fight for us in the revolution, if you fight for the British. You feel what I'm saying? Respect to the British, you know what I'm saying? Respect to Great Britain for ending that slavery, for facilitating, you know what I'm saying, the caravan to end slavery. But without further ado, this is just like something I wanted to do, you know. Just something serious, you know. But anyway, thank you again. I appreciate y'all so much for watching the video. If you liked it, leave a comment. Leave a comment. Say what you guys say. I read all the comments. Leave a like. Hit that subscribe button. Post notifications if you haven't already. Hope you have a great day. I'm out. Peace.